this kind of nonsense.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the example you gave of what happened after the Archduke Ferdinand was killed turned into a world war that nobody thought was going to happen at the time. So your point is quite valid about what could happen here if we do that. Let's hope we don't have to find out. You mentioned a second ago one of the other issues that we'd like your view on, and that is with the Russia-Ukraine war. There have been some recent developments here. Just overnight, Ukraine hit 20 additional, and this has been going on. This is a new campaign. 20 additional Russian so-called shadow fleet vessels in the Black Sea overnight. Most of these were civilian vessels, according to the story here. The unmanned systems forces of Ukraine struck 20 vessels from Russia's so-called shadow fleet near the occupied Crimean Peninsula on the night of 14-15 July. Of the 20 vessels struck, 17 were oil tankers, 2 were gas tankers, and 1 was a tugboat. Russia yesterday had started belatedly getting back into this war here as well in the Black Sea and in the Sea of Azov, and they hit a civilian Ukrainian tanker. So now people are saying, is this the new theater of operations here, where now it's going to go back into more in the naval stuff? What impact is this going to have on the war?
Well, there's several points. The first is no one should delude themselves into believing that these kinds of strikes are going to rescue Ukraine from defeat, that this is going to turn around the war. That's all nonsense. Ukraine is doomed to destruction, sadly. And the second part of this is that the Ukrainians have taken advantage of relative indefensible targets at sea in the Russian Navy. You know, this goes back to some of the discussions we had recently when we were talking with Joe Kent. The Russians have learned a great deal. Their ground force has adapted brilliantly. If you look at what's happening along the front line of troops, where the edge of the battle is and where things are happening, the Russian troops have clearly learned how to cope with these unmanned systems. And instead of rushing in and executing these encirclements, what they call cauldron battles, in the space of 2 or 3 days, it takes 10 days to 2 weeks because they want to avoid unnecessary casualties. And they know that the people that they're fighting have no chance. So it's very deliberate, it's very methodical, and it works. And they're ultimately destroying more and more and more ashore. What they haven't done is looked at the reality in the Black Sea. And when you go into these ports in Crimea or anywhere along the coast of the Black Sea that's Russian, it's very hard to protect these vessels that are sitting at anchor. And as they close with Ukraine, as they move in proximity to where these weapons are being launched from, it's harder and harder to protect them. They need to adjust things there. I think some heads are going to roll in the Russian naval forces. If I were going to predict anything, I think that's an absolute certainty, because this sort of business shouldn't happen. But finally, we need to understand that eventually this is going to end. And it's going to end with Russia in control of Odessa. It's going to end with Russia in control of Kharkov. It's going to end with Russian control of this thing they call Novorossiya. The Russians are not interested in owning Western Ukraine. They want it to be neutral. They don't want it to be another assembly point for future operations against them, which is exactly what we've done with it. And that's why they don't trust us anymore. That's why they're not going to really talk to us seriously. At least this administration has no chance of reaching them. And I think the Western globalists that are behind all this are being ignored. If they keep it up, then yes, they could be at risk of many things. But right now, Russians want to finish this business in eastern Ukraine once and for all. And that will involve taking Odessa. When they decide to do this is something I can't predict with certainty, but it will happen.
Well, somebody who wants to prevent it from happening is Ursula von der Leyen in the European Union, who herself flew into Kiev today, and she had a big press conference with Volodymyr Zelensky in light of his conversation with President Trump at the NATO summit a few days back. And Zelensky was feeling kind of froggy, and here's what he had to say.
Ukraine and Europe will create an anti-ballistic shield together for the first time, a historic project where Ukraine is not an observer, but one of the leaders, uniting countries and the strongest defense enterprises in Europe. The Freya project has been initiated. We will do everything to build a European anti-ballistic system by uniting all European anti-ballistic capabilities so that the skies of our nations are protected.
So, man, great news. Now there's going to be there used to be an iron curtain. Now there's going to be an air shield that's going to stop everything from Russia coming into Western Europe. And it's going to start right there in Ukraine. What do you say to that?
Well, I could see millions of Europeans lining up to deliver their first child to Zelensky so he can sell their organs and accumulate the cash that he needs to build this ridiculous notion. This is not going to happen. You and I know this. Bring back Ted Postel. There are many others besides Ted, and they're physicists, and they will tell you that until we can break the laws of physics and we figure out how to break the laws of fractal mathematics, develop the kind of energy that's required that'll make these particle beams work, and we create, Bill Shatner's beam me up capability, or, shields that he calls for every time he's on the Starship Enterprise. We're a long way from that sort of thing. And if you don't have that, whatever you put up is not going to work. You can overwhelm it. And that's something the Russians have learned. They right now are protecting a front of at least 1,000 miles, if you look at it. They have been remarkably successful at stopping most of the unmanned systems, missiles, drones, and so forth hurled at them. But they never stop them all. Something always leaks through, because the technology we have is just not that good. Now, again, will that change at some point? I'm sure it will. But this is all literally nonsense. The Europeans are not going to chip in to the extent that they need to. This is another Star Wars defense, bottomless pit for monies everywhere in Europe, in the United States, and anywhere else. And anybody who pushes for this is certifiable. Won't work.
And and even if they want to dream about this William Shatner stuff, the best case scenario is you're talking 3 to 5 years into the future before this could even produce these mythical, great interceptor missiles. Where is the mentality of these people think that they're going to? Do they really think? And maybe the answer is yes, that they can continue to fight for another 3 to 5 years, waiting for that new missile shield to come up.
Well, it's not a question what they think, it's what they believe. You and I know, we've talked about this before. It takes you roughly from start to finish 10 years to build a new army. That's what it took us to recover from the Vietnam War. The force that we took over in 1965 was utterly devastated. We had to start over. That meant everything had to change in some form. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but the outcome was what you saw in 1990 and 91. You've got a similar situation today. People do not understand what it takes to achieve the kind of military capability they're discussing. Everybody thinks, go down to the local supermarket, go to Aldi, go to Lidl, go to Giant, go down and you look on the shelves and you can buy missile defense. You can buy satellites. You can buy new stealth tanks that turn invisible. I mean, people don't know. They don't have any understanding. And that's the fault of our educational system. But politicians have nothing invested in the truth. They are permanently invested in fiction. You've seen this magnificent film called Waterworld. And, you have Dennis Hopper, who's now passed away, who holds up this little girl with a map on the back of her back and says, here's the map to dry land. And everybody, cheers. And he says, so dry land is within reach. Now row. And everybody runs off to row and row and row. And then one of the people says, well, are you sure about this? He says, who cares? They'll row for 2 weeks because they figure out that I'm full of crap. Unfortunately, I think that's the mentality that works so terribly well in politics in the West. Just tell them whatever you need to, and it'll be weeks before they figure out it's a lot of nonsense.
And by then you'll have some new nonsense. One of the other things that is also happening, and not just in the Sea of Azov with the advancement of this striking these ships, but there's also movements in the Baltics to where there's a growing chorus that's pointing to fingers to Russia and saying they're they're going to invade us and they're going to invade Western Europe. That question was put to Dmitry Peskov this morning, and he had this to say.
Литовская разведка сообщила о том, что Россия якобы планирует атаки на инфраструктуру Прибалтики и Европы. И в связи с этим литовский президент Гитанас Науседа призвал усилить охрану важных инфраструктурных объектов. Как бы вы могли прокомментировать свежую порцию обвинений и подозрений со стороны прибалтийского государства?
Ну, вы знаете, это именно свежая порция таких страшилок для того, чтобы продолжить промывание мозгов и для того, чтобы готовить население к дальнейшей милитаризации. Для этого нужно создать образ врага на какой-то другой стороне, в данном случае на нашей, и под эту лавочку, как у нас говорят, продолжить подтягивать в страны Прибалтики военную инфраструктуру.
I'm not sure if you could read all that on the bottom, but the bottom line is he was asked about the claim that Russia is going to attack into Western Europe and possibly even into the Baltics. And he almost says, ironically, a version of what you just said there, there's no truth. They're just saying this to try to build up they have to have an enemy and they're making us an enemy here. But that's not in our interest here. But, I actually have the question though, Doug, if they say this enough, meaning on the West, and they start moving like more German troops into the Baltics, they start doing more missile defense, and they bring in more potential NATO capability. Could this be a self-fulfilling prophecy where Russia will eventually feel compelled to do something in the Baltics?
Well, I think to a large extent, the NATO leadership has been trying, certainly for the last 2 or 3 years, to bait President Putin. And by that, I mean bait him into acting recklessly in response to this kind of nonsense. Why would they do that? Why would they say these things? And I think one of the big reasons is that they are trying desperately to drag us in. Okay? This is the Israeli strategic program. How do we drag in the United States? What has Netanyahu said repeatedly? We share the same enemies. Our interests are the same. We are the same people. No, we are not Israelis. We don't share their values. We don't share their culture. They're very different from us. There's nothing wrong with that, but they're not the same. We do not share the same enemies. In fact, we don't have to have very many enemies at all. That's the great genius of the American Republic and the people that founded it who understood it 250 years ago. There's no reason for us to have these enemies. So the biggest mistake that I think Putin could make is to be baited into something. And right now, that's the danger. Not so much that anybody in the Baltic states is dumb enough to fire any missiles into Russia. Now, they've been foolish insofar as they have allowed the Ukrainians to use their territory and airspace from time to time to attack targets in Russia. Big mistake. That should stop as soon as possible. And I pay tribute to the Russians for exercising restraint and not overreacting to that kind of stupidity. I think the Poles are waking up. The Poles have finally figured out that this Ukrainian state is a criminal organization. It's not just a money pit that will never be filled. It's much worse than that. So I don't see any evidence that the Poles are going to sign up for any of the stupidity anymore. It'll take time to climb down from it because being anti-Russian is almost inseparable from being a Polish nationalist. It's sort of like the Irish nationalists had to be anti-English in order to be Irish nationalists. Well, the Poles have a similar problem. But I think they can overcome that. The problem is with these globalists further west, and their agenda is the destruction of us. They're much more concerned about ensuring that Europe is overrun by millions of non-Europeans and ultimately destroys Europe from within than they are about anything that happens in Russia. But that means that you also want to point to an external enemy. The problem is the external enemy is not the enemy. The enemy is their own government. And I think more and more Europeans are figuring that out. Eventually, it will result in a dramatic upheaval on the scale of the revolutions of 1848. I think they're coming.
Well, that's certainly not going to be good for anybody. Interestingly, President Putin, you talk about is he going to invade us or not? He made a speech before a public auditorium, I think it was yesterday, to where he may actually be supporting what you said there, that he's going to be a little bit more patient. But he also said, talk about looking at scoreboards, kind of laid out, here's what the West has been trying to do to us up to this point, and here in his interpretation is the score.
We ask ourselves why this Russophobic part of the collective West fights us, and we, in response, develop our economy, strengthen our financial system, improve our military, achieve new results in our industrial complex, and we're moving forward, we're advancing, our boys, our troops are advancing. How does that happen? Well, that is thanks to you, thanks to your efforts.
So he said, we tried to destroy them with sanctions. We tried to destroy their economy. We tried to destroy them militarily by helping Ukraine, et cetera. And he said, instead, we're stronger. We outlasted them financially and economically. And he seems to say they're on the right path. So does that tell you that Russia may not strike at any of those things, even if the long-range missiles keep coming in and they'll just do the slow, methodical path?
I think he's going to stick with the slow, methodical path because that's his preferred method. On the other hand, I think he understands the anger and frustration inside the Russian population. I mean, how could you not be angry when Russian citizens in St. Petersburg or Moscow or Rostov are killed mindlessly on the street as a result of some rogue drone attack that has no real military utility at all? So I think that's quite clear. But there's something more important here that we should bear in mind. Russia, if you talk to Russians and if you take the trouble to read what they publish, the Russians are very open about saying, look, our society is not perfect, but we're working on it. Our economy is not as strong as it should be, but we're working on it. And our military was too weak. We've changed that, and we're working on it. In other words, there's an awareness of imperfection. There's an awareness that things have to improve, and there's a readiness to do it, to support it, to make it happen. That's why Russia is not going to be defeated. That's why we're in trouble. Because if you turn to the Americans say, well, this government. And I agree with them. I think the government has failed us. I think the social contract is defunct. But that doesn't mean we don't need a government. We very much need a government. We just don't need what we've got. And that's not a function of just Donald Trump. That's the whole shebang that we've had for the last 30 plus years. We can deal with that. And Americans have to come around to understanding that has to change, and they have to understand we can do that. We can actually make a difference. We haven't gotten there yet because we don't have adequate organization and leadership. I hope that comes. I'm working on it, as you are, and I think a lot of other people are. But I think it's very important to understand the Russian mentality. And I think Putin enjoys the support he does to the tune of, 82%, 83% approval, because he speaks in those terms, and that resonates very strongly with the Russian people.
It's just, wow, you couldn't have set this up any better. In a bad way, sort of. You talk about the Russians are aware of their imperfections and they're working on it in all these different categories. And then you contrast that with the United States. Well, it turns out I got a couple of examples of that in the last few minutes that we got here. Let's take a look at just within our own borders here. Right now, we are trying to get, number one, we're trying to get for the NDAA a $1.5 trillion defense budget, a massive growth in just a single year from $1 trillion, which is already way more than anybody else. But apparently even that's not enough. Now we're trying to slide in a $350 billion supplemental on top of that. And listen to the explanation given by Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson.
The question was, can you list the specifics of what the request is for the Pentagon? We've seen it's over $350 billion as a request, and some of this is transformational kind of funding that will help us change the dynamic of the Department of War and make it more efficient and effective. It's already the greatest fighting force on the planet, not even close. But there are some ideas, a real vision on how to improve that even further, to bolster that. You've heard the president talk about how he wants to effectively double the funding for national defense. Look, we live in dangerous times. We're fighting communism on our own shores, and we're fighting evil terrorists and tyrants around the world. And we have to be able to protect our national security. So this is not the place to get into the details of that.
So we're the greatest fighting force in history of all time. No one else is even close. He repeats President Trump. Well, if it was, then why am I going to spend another $500 billion and 350 more billion on top of that? And, you know, it sounds to me like, Doug, and this is what I'd like your view on, it sounds to me like we're looking for monsters to slay so that we can justify the money.
Well, that goes without saying, but there's also just a lot of corruption involved in this. Let's look at the first comment that he made. He starts talking about all these alleged enemies, but you and I know that those are lies. He did mention one enemy. Now, he called it communism. I presume he's talking about the new mayor of New York City, who obviously identifies strongly with the tenets of Karl Marx in many respects. And he's characterizing that as an enemy. Okay. I'll sign up, at least insofar as he's identified a serious problem here inside the United States. I can come up with lots of problems inside the U.S. I can come up with lots of threats. I can say, look, what do you do about the majority of young men and women between the ages of 20 and 40 inside the United States who can't find employment? And those that do, that make any money, aren't making more than 60, 70, 80,000 a year. And after you pay rent and you pay for your groceries and you're dealing with inflation as well as your gasoline and so forth, you've got nothing left, which means you effectively have no savings. I think that's an existential threat to the republic. I think we have more than 50 million people living inside the United States who were not born in this country. That's a serious problem. That's a larger percentage of our population than ever in our history. And it's not benign. Lots of these people have come here and they're determined to make us over into what they think we ought to be. The last time I looked, everybody wanted to come here because they liked it the way it is. All of a sudden now, everybody that built the society, the country, the industries, the science, the technology is no longer liked because they happen to be white. This kind of nonsense needs to stop, but nobody's addressing it. And Mike Johnson isn't going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. He and his opponents on the left are all in the same boat on these things. They don't want to take on these difficult issues. But the overseas picture, that's crap. There are no Russian armies or Chinese armies or navies or anything else gathering forces to invade us. Nobody's interested in wasting money on it. That's why all of these claims in Europe are ludicrous nonsense. Europeans don't want to waste money trying to build some giant force with which to invade Russia. There's no reason to invade Russia. Russia doesn't want to invade them. This is crap. And somebody needs to stand up and say it's crap, but you're feeding at the trough. That trough in Washington is huge. It's a mountain of slop. And all the pigs have rushed in. And they want to keep feeding. And they're dependent upon a government that feeds them. By the way, they're not feeding us. Our population, 90% of it, is not benefiting in any way, shape, or form. 10% of the population owns everything and spends all the money.
Well, and just to put a sharp point on that, later today, President Trump is going to be at a meeting. He's actually going to make some public statements, and this here, he's going to address the defense technology gathering, even as the Iran war has reduced our weapons stockpiles. Key things in here. The White House said the summit is bringing together key leaders in defense and some of the largest global investors to spotlight the importance of national security. There we go. Again, we're looking at those dragons overseas to go slay. But then you look at that long list of folks who are right there at that trough you just described, trying to get some of that $350 billion and then the $1.5 trillion next year. Where does this end, Doug?
Well, looking at the list, we all know who Jamie Dimon is. And to his credit, recently, he's been pointing to the danger that lurks of a complete financial collapse. He's talked about the bond market. He understands the debasement of currency. I don't know what he would say in private, but one would hope that Diamond would carry that message to the president. This is not the time to spend more on much of anything. I don't know Blackstone, can't comment, or the others. I know that this Phoebe Novakovic is a former CIA employee. She may still be a CIA officer who is currently heading General Dynamics. I don't know. These people are the enemies of anyone who wants to reduce spending. They're the enemies of anyone who doesn't want to double down on spending on their pet projects, their pet rocks. And they feel justified. And they are part of this multi-million dollar / billion dollar elite, the Epstein class, as we call them. They're in charge. And that's what they want. And we are not in charge. We have no influence. You know, this is where you find that even though I would not have voted for Mamdani in New York City, and I dislike many of the things he says, he's ultimately telling the truth about the Epstein class. And he's not the only one. There has to be some common ground between the two sides of these arguments, because we've got to put a stop to this stuff. We're not going to survive this if we keep it up. And you and I and a lot of others have talked about these problems for years. We're approaching the point of no return.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm an advocate of what you were talking about. The system has to be changed. And this so-called two-party, but it's more the uniparty, as you've said several times, certainly on these kinds of issues, exclude everybody else. And they'll lie and say everything that they want to hear on the mainstream media, which will just dutifully put it out there, other than shows like this and things that you do and other places that you go. We're just going to have to see if we can get more mass up from the bottom up, or you may be right. We may be powerless later on, and it could come back and crash on top of all of us, because this can't be sustained no matter what they want to do. I think that's important to point out.
Yeah, well, that's why I say we've reached the point of no return. One more step, and we fall into the abyss where we have no control whatsoever. And it would be a mistake, and this is very important too. The people on that list do not think that anything bad can happen to them. They're wrong. And the lesson of history is very straightforward. If you go back to the various revolutionary events, the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848, the Communard in Paris in 1871, you see three things that lead to these bloody encounters between the population and the government and the ruling elites. One is debt. Debt is always the enemy. Debt destroys. 2, deception, the failure to tell the truth. Debt and deception. Those things are very, very important. And ultimately, the last one is the collapse of any faith or confidence whatsoever in the governing bodies, the institutions, and the elites that dominate them. Those things inevitably lead to revolutionary conditions. And these people should think about that. This is the wrong time to add to the debt load. This is the wrong time to spend more on these overseas catastrophes. This is the wrong time to expand the so-called hegemonic power that we think we enjoy in the world. And of course, you also risk loss overseas. And it was the loss overseas, along with the debt and the deceptions and the elite corruption and degeneration, that brought on the French Revolution. We need to understand these things. We are not immune. We are not unique. We are human. All human entities suffer from similar maladies. The difference between us and others is that we have a lot of people that know what's going on, a lot of people that understand it, and they haven't acted to stop it.
We'll have to see whether that comes, and we can certainly hope that they do, and do everything we can to try and accelerate that change before it does get too late, if it's not already. Thank you, though, so much, though, for coming on today.